Good morning, everyone. This is Nathan Lindorf with the Rational Independent. Before I scoot out to the airport, we're going to briefly discuss from Business Insider. You may or may not know, but Governor Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, has been making some overtures to try and get himself seen credibly on a national stage. I wonder why a regional politician, a state politician might be interested in doing that. I know. He wants to be president. There's an expectation among the Democratic Party that Joe Biden, being the incumbent, will run again in 2024. But President Biden is very, very old and will be, I believe, the oldest presidential candidate in history. Being old, he has the risk of a health issue, a breakdown. I mean, when you get old, stuff just happens. And sometimes there's no coming back from it. So there's a handful of people in the Democratic Party that are quietly positioning themselves so they can step into the gap in case the heir apparent, President Biden, is unable to run for one reason or another. Because goodness knows his vice president is a disaster. So we have a fluff piece from Business Insider regarding on Saturday, Governor Newsom sent a letter to the different book publishers, textbook publishers, regarding whether or not any of them are complying with Florida's extremist demands. I think the threat implicit is that if you comply with Florida, then California will reject you. It's interesting to me from a reporting perspective. He sends the letter on Saturday. Business Insider sent a comment to the Florida State Department of Education, a request for comment, on Sunday, and Monday morning, the article goes out. So theoretically, they did ask for comment, but you asked for comment from a government agency on a Sunday, and you're shocked they didn't get back to you. This is not a world on fire issue. There's no reason why this sort of reporting needs to take place over a weekend. Would it really make a difference if we published this article on Wednesday and gave Florida a chance to respond? Or would you worry that their response might undermine your reporting? This way you get to look fair, but you also get to cut out the other guy. I'm going to read a paragraph from the letter just to give us an idea of how Governor Newsom, of his language and tone and what he's doing here. California will not be complicit in Florida's attempt to whitewash history through laws and backroom deals. Parents have a right to know what's happening in the dark to undermine our children's education. And California deserves to know whether any of these companies designing textbooks for our state's classrooms are the same ones kowtowing to Florida's extremist agenda. Here's the thing. If you just switched a few letters or a few words around, the exact same paragraph could be written by someone who's worried about transgender ideology in school textbooks. Floridians will not be complicit in California's attempt to whitewash history through laws and backroom deals. Parents have a right to know what's happening in the dark to undermine our children's education. Florida deserves to know whether any of these companies designing textbooks for our state's classrooms are the same ones kowtowing to California's extremist agenda. The framing is the same. That's a paragraph that credibly could have been written by someone who's worried that extremist transgender activists in, say, California are pushing their content into Florida schools. And I think that's the core we're going to talk about. We're going to keep it brief today because I got to get to the airport. One of the great rules of life, when it comes to my 2 cents, we're going to talk about this framing. One of the most important things that I learned from Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People is that everybody, without exception, every single person in the human race tells themselves a story where they're the good guy. Think about how fundamental that is. Everyone frames their actions so that they can tell themselves a story that they believe where their actions make them the good guy. Failing that, where the other guy's actions make them the bad guy. This is the framing that the human mind requires, unless you're insane. If you're clinically insane, all bets are off. But the funny thing is, even if you look at people who are sociopathic, look at people who are schizophrenic, look at people whose minds are seriously broken, they will still take the position that they're in the right, or that they are a victim of unfair forces persecuting them. In other words, that the other guys are bad guys. The trick with supervillains in comic books is that supervillains own their villainy and embrace their villainy. That doesn't happen in real life. You may think Donald Trump is a villain. Donald Trump does not think he's a villain. On the other side, you may think Hillary Clinton or Chuck Schumer or AOC is villainous. If you talk to those people, they don't think they're villains. And that means you cannot use, since the moral framework of villainy and right and wrong is universal across all political sides, since the framing of villainy, since the framing of moral virtue fighting against the evil oppressors is the same moral framing, whether you're left or right. If it's universal to the human race, it's going to be universal to the groups the human race creates. Seems pretty sound logic. And so if it is universal, it's not useful as a comparative tool. What I mean by that is the language that Governor Newsom is using to try and enforce his will and raise his profile nationally is moral framing. He's embracing the moral standards of the people he thinks will read this letter. He is adopting a posture where he's the good guy fighting against the evils of political corruption and tyranny and oppression. But that framing is not an argument or a position that can be argued against. If you allow that to be the framing of the argument, then you, in order to oppose Governor Newsom, you have to claim your own villainy. If you give him the moral high ground of being the virtuous crusader against oppression, that means the only position left is for you to be the tyrannical force that oppresses. That's a losing argument. No one wants to side with the tyrannical. That's not how the human mind works. That's one of the reasons why everybody frames it this way, particularly in a political context, because if you can make your opponent the bad guy, you're going to win your political contest. How have they treated Donald Trump the last, long time? Oh yeah, they make him the bad guy. If you look at the discussion on the political left around Donald Trump, it is almost exclusively centered around this rhetorical trick where they're trying to make the case that Donald Trump is a monster and only monsters can support him. And therefore, they don't have to engage with any of the substance of the position that he takes, with any of the substance of his arguments, because you don't have to engage with the substance of an argument that a monster is making, because they're not a human being, they're a monster. The irony is, if you successfully make another person, or worse, group of people into monsters, you have now created oppression, tyranny. You've created the very things that you claim to argue against. And that's the point I'm trying to draw to in this conversation. Governor Newsom casts himself as the virtuous crusader, but the only way a critical mind can look at a political actor is to look at the fruits. I mean, Jesus was a pretty smart guy. This is the principle that he taught us. By their fruits ye shall know them. A good tree cannot bring forth bad fruit. A bad tree cannot bring forth bad fruit. How do you know it's an apricot tree? Because it grows apricots. That is the logical exercise. How do we know the nature of the tree? We look at what it produces. Oh, it's a pear tree. Oh, it's an apple tree. The type of tree that it is dictated by the fruit it produces. You have to look at political actors and cut out, and it can be hard, it can be awkward, but you have to completely filter out the moral framing because everybody frames the same way. So it's not useful when it comes to analyzing the merits of their arguments. You have to cut out the moral framing. You have to cut out the crusading. You have to cut out the virtuous positions that they're claiming. And you have to look at the fruits. You have to look and see what this person has wrought, what this organization has wrought. For instance, there are moral arguments that can be made that say that abortion is a moral good. They talk about freedom, bodily autonomy, freedom from oppression. They talk about the victimization of vulnerable women who have been raped or who have been victims of incest or a variety of other things. A mother who's in danger from her fetus. It's a dangerous task to grow a baby, and sometimes medically it goes horribly wrong, and you have to choose between the life of the mother or the life of the child. All of these things can be morally framed to make pro-abortion people the good guys. And on the other side, you can take the abortion issue and you can morally frame it around arguments towards that the government exists to protect the right to life, that you cannot have bodily autonomy if you allow your body to be destroyed, that much of the time the women who do this are themselves coerced into doing this. They are now pregnant and do not have a supportive husband, or do not have, in some circumstance or another, the baby creates vulnerability for the mother. And so they choose an abortion, not because they want to kill their baby, but because they realize that that may be something that they have to do. These are arguments that can be made from the side that is against abortion. You can morally frame it in both cases, but at the end of the day, the most useful analysis is to look at the fruits. Look at women who have had an abortion and ask them anonymously, so you can try and get private answers, try and get more honest answers, whether or not that abortion was the right thing for them to do. Ask them 10, 20 years later. Ask them if they regret their decision. Ask them if they've had any medical complications from the procedure that they underwent in order to accomplish the abortion. On the flip side, ask women who considered an abortion and chose instead to have the baby 5 years later, 10 years later, 30 years later. Do they regret that decision? Look at the lives of those who could have been aborted and their parents instead chose to bring them to life. Some of those lives are going to be our most brilliant writers, scientists, actors, engineers, business leaders. Humanity has potential for good. And in order for humanity to bring that potential into reality, we have to let the life come into the world. And sometimes the people who are born are terrible people. That's human nature. But other times, they are the best of us. That is the fruit of abortion, is reducing. There are many fruits to the practice of abortion. But as an example for our larger rhetorical argument about how to analyze political positions, when I look at the fruits of abortion, I don't see good. I see evil. I think it's a bad tree. I think the fruit it produces is genocidal. It's terrible. And we can get into that more. We probably will over time, but that's my position in that particular issue. And how I arrived at that position is I set aside moral grandstanding, that moral framing that says I'm the virtuous crusader, and I try and look at the fruits of the policy position. And I don't see good fruits when it comes to pro-abortion policy, so I can't support it. When I look at Governor Newsom, what he's really saying is, hey, I'm over here in California, and you're a textbook company that produces textbooks for the whole country. If you comply with the legal requirements of another state, then we will ban your books. It's a threat to censorship. It's a threat against their business model. It's a way of trying to take a private entity and force them to pick a fight with the Florida legislature on California's behalf. It's a political pressure tactic. The only fruits that I can see from this are potentially Gavin Newsom's national profile gets raised. Good for him. Potentially, you have some business pain when it comes to these private entities that are trying to figure out how they're going to navigate this thorny political mess. But when you choose to do business with the government, that's a thorny mess you got to deal with. And I see this as another element of the ongoing pressure campaign against Ron DeSantis and his efforts, combined with his rather friendly legislature's efforts in Florida. Governor DeSantis and the Florida legislature are trying to put forth good political solutions to what they see as cultural issues. It's pretty tough to actually affect the culture from a political perspective. But I can appreciate them with the profile that they have, trying to raise these issues, trying to take these stands, trying to do the right thing, trying to bring forth good fruit. It is worthwhile for all of us to take a moment and look at the positions that we've adopted personally and try and figure out why we adopted those positions. Did we adopt them because they're part of the story that we tell ourselves that makes us the good guy? Because if we did, that's not much. We didn't put a lot of effort into that. I think we can put a little more effort. Pick an issue that you think you haven't really invested in, that you haven't really put the effort in to understand why you believe the way you believe, and do some research, do some homework, do some study, talk to people, seek out people you disagree with, and ask them to make the case for the position you disagree with. if you are open, you might be persuaded. And you need to be more firmly persuaded than just deciding, you know what, my mom said that when I was a kid that this was something that was important to her. So you know what, that's my position on taxes or welfare or abortion or whatever. And I haven't really thought about it since. All right, that's my Reddit rant for today. Good luck out there.